The leaders of what is in reality the government's pseudo-science team of propaganda held a press conference the other day whose basic purpose was to act as a kind of battering ram of terror for the introduction of new measures to combat that which now does not even figure among the country's 10 biggest killers. It's been beaten off the charts by even lymphatic conditions, and according to the most recent ONS numbers, accounted for just 1% of all deaths in England and Wales. And also testing has doubled over the last 2 months, and you can see how it's skyrocketed in the last couple of weeks. They're frantically looking for cases now. The shock troops' big sell here was a potentially exponential rise in cases, and they based it on what was either a sleight of hand or a con trick, or possibly simply not understanding that you can't use selective information in this way. But these are educated people. I don't think they don't know that. I'm convinced at this point that this was basically a con trick. And here is a 60-second clip of the main part.
What I'd like to do is just remind you how quickly this can move. So the next slide is not a prediction, but it is a way of thinking about how quickly this can change. So this is the UK reported cases per day against time. And you can see running along the bottom there the number of cases over June, July and August, up to roughly 3,000 cases per day or so in September, middle of September. At the moment, we think that the epidemic is doubling roughly every 7 days. It could be a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, but let's say roughly every 7 days. If, and that's quite a big if, but if that continues unabated and this grows doubling every 7 days, then what you see, of course, let's say there were 5,000 today, it would be 10,000 next week, 20,000 the week after, 40,000 the week after. And you can see that by mid-October, if that continued, you would end up with something like 50,000 cases in the middle of October per day.
And the explosive claim, the bit designed to terrify people:
at the moment, we think that the epidemic is doubling roughly every 7 days.
He called it a scenario and not a prediction. However, it's the only scenario they present, and they know full well that it will permeate into the public consciousness as a prediction and then as a certainty. And it's propaganda, falsely advancing the idea of an exponential rise in cases for the purpose of scaring people into compliance. So where does he get to the point of being able to put forward this scenario alone? If doubling occurred every 7 days, what would it look like? Where is this doubling? Well, it is there if you look hard enough. One thing to say is that the red on the right is the scenario and not the reality, but it looks like reality, doesn't it? It looks real enough, and it's the colour red, the colour of blood. These are all psychological tricks at the end of the day. Anyway, doubling every 7 days. The blue is the actual cases, infections, up to the present day. The red, again, is where the prediction starts, where the blood starts to flow. If you take that point there, 4 days earlier, track back 2 weeks, and divide it up into 2 one-week portions, that's the first week, and that is the second. Over the course of that week, cases more or less double, and over the course of the following week, the same thing happens. The first thing to say is that there is one rather large fly in the ointment that right at the end of the actual data, the last 4 days, cases are actually falling, which puts a bit of a crimp in the pants of this apocalyptic scenario. And if you take the exact last week of numbers, you get cases flat or maybe a tad down. So what is going on with this doubling business? It's selective data to fit your contention. When I was an online gambler, I would periodically bitch and whine about being cheated when I played, for example, 500 hands of Boss Media single-deck blackjack, oh the happy memories, and end up, say, 100 hands down, which is a very nasty swing downwards for 500 hands. Unfortunately, you can't base conclusions on selective information, because you end up looking for patterns and finding them. By definition, it's a self-fulfilling exercise. Selective data proves your contention by definition. So in that case there I just mentioned, I tested the game properly many years ago now, and lo and behold, I was wrong and the results were fair. The point being, if you don't know what you're doing, or you pretend you don't know what you're doing, you draw bogus conclusions. Paddy Vallance has gone looking for a radical increase of cases in short order. He's found them right there, and he's based his contention on it, that of cases doubling every week. If, on the other hand, you step back a bit, as you obviously should do, it suddenly looks a lot less significant. And if you step right the way back, that kind of a 2-week time period looks much less significant again. It looks fairly inconsequential. That is the proper way to do it, looking at the entirety of the thing, and that is the contric way to do it. But when you've got something like this lined up,
we will put more police out on the streets and use the army to backfill if necessary.
When you're threatening the first sniffings of martial law, you need something a little bit more impactful than cases doubling over 10 weeks, which is actually what their own graph shows there. They chose those 14 days of data, but the whole graph they put up covers 2.5 months. A shed load more information is available on their own graph, even if it is still not the whole picture. You need something a lot more hard-hitting than that, and they don't have it, so they manipulate the numbers. They basically con you. I'm not in the habit of quoting ageing rock stars, or knowing anything at all about ageing rock stars for that matter. However, quoting ageing rock stars who are quoting more substantial people is forgivable. Ian Brown, who is from something called Stone Roses, and who is virulently anti the most fascist of the coronavirus measures, which basically means pretty much all of them at this point, quoted George Orwell thuswise: "All tyrannies rule through fraud and force, but once the fraud is exposed, they must rely exclusively on force." At the very least, the fraud is exposed. A little summary of what I was saying above here. You get the point, right? You keep taking a step back and getting a better look with each step at the real picture, because each time the little snippet of data they want you to focus on, to the exclusion of everything else, gets less consequential each time. But this isn't what the liars want you to see. They just want you to focus on that little snippet and be hypnotized by it. And if you aren't convinced by the lies, which having watched this video you might not be, they just
put more police out on the streets and use the army.
Which is, obviously enough, a pretty unanswerable response, but it does make the point that when the fraud is exposed, they get the guns out. Although I think here they didn't actually wait for the fraud to be exposed before threatening to get the guns out. I think they had a pretty good idea that it would all fall apart in pretty short order, so they might as well do the whole thing basically in one go.